Thank you, Paul. We have now reached the Q&A session. If you have any questions for Prof. York or the panelists, you can post your questions via Pigeonhole at www.pigeonhole.at or raise your hands to request for a mic from our colleagues. With that, may I invite the following moderators and panelists up on stage, please. First, we have Mr. Pei Fang from Singapore, Program Director, Singapore Stanford Biodesign and CEO of MedTech startup Advent Access Private Limited. Mr. Pei will be the co-moderator for this session. Next, we have Dr. John Collins from Boston, COO of Consortium of Leading Teaching Hospitals and Universities, Center for Integration of Medicine and Innovative Technology. Mr. Lu Yo-Shi from Singapore, Executive Chairman from one of Asia's leading medtech company, Biosensors International. Prof. Sun Kyung from Korea, Chair of Osong Medical Innovation Foundation and Professor of Korea University College of Medicine. Prof. Tan Zawi from Singapore, Deputy Executive Director of ASTA's Biomedical Research Council. Dr. Fumiyaki Ikeno from Japan, Program Director US of Japan Biodesign. And last but not least, Dr. Chris Shen from Silicon Valley, Executive Director US of Singapore Stanford Biodesign and Managing Director of VC Fund Vertex Ventures Healthcare. Dr. Shen is also the co-moderator for this session. I will now hand over the mic to Mr. Pei. Mr. Pei, please.
Okay, everybody hear me okay? Okay, can you all hear me okay? All right, great. So we'll come to the Q&A portion of today's event. And today, on top of having Professor Paul York, we're actually very privileged to put together a distinguished panel with very deep experience in setting up medtech innovation ecosystems, either in different parts of Asia or in the US. So we are going to start off the Q&A session by first having a few moderated questions that Chris and I will be given to the panel. Then we'll open up to the floor for the audience to ask questions either from Pigeonhole, website that Arena have shared with you, or coming up front to the mic.
Thank you again to all the panelists coming from all corners of the globe to come here. This is really an expert panel who can really talk a lot about innovation and about the ecosystem of medtech. We just heard a great summary of a vast amount of information from Paul. And he covered a wide range of topics, not only about mentorship, but also driving over to value-based innovation as well. We're going to be going through a number of questions, really talking about what are some of the key ingredients and what are some of the unique attributes and also some of the commonalities of developing a medtech ecosystem here in Asia. We think this is very important to really developing a sustainable environment for medtech innovation. We've covered this in a number of different forums around the world. Most recently in Japan, we had a conference really talking about the new nascent Japan biodesign program and how we can really build a sustainable community similar to what we've seen in Silicon Valley as well. But I'll turn it over to Ray to kick off the first question.
Sure. So the first question we have, which actually I think our colleagues have already flashed on the screen, which is the one with 5 votes. So the first question we want to have for the panel is, what do you think are the key ingredients that make medtech innovation ecosystem successful? So building on to what we've heard from Paul, what do you think are the key ingredients that can make a certain community have the type of innovation output we see in Silicon Valley, the type of insights? Are these ingredients actually different from different countries? So help us learn how in Asia we can have similar kind of outputs. Or which are these factors are actually universal? We don't have to think about, in the US or in Europe it's different than in Asia. There's some factors that are universal. So for this first question, I'd like to direct to Mr. John Collins and Professor Tan Zui and Prof. Sung, whom John will be able to speak from his capacity as a CEO of CIMMYT, which is a consortium of hospitals and universities in Boston that actually put together the Boston MedTech ecosystem. Hear from him, is there any more things to add as he put together ecosystem in Boston? Then we can hear from Prof. Tan and Prof. Sung on how ecosystems in Singapore, Korea, you believe will need, if they need different ingredients, or is the same?
Well, first, one clarification, the ecosystem existed in Boston before CIMMYT. So our mission in life is to try to streamline it and make it more effective. I think one of the most important things you think about healthcare innovation ecosystems is, by their very nature, they're constantly changing. And I think if you listen to Paul's talk, there are two critical components that we see across the board. First is you need to have world-class medical institutions. That's where the needs are. If you don't have these clinical innovators who understand the needs, no matter what you're going to do from a technology perspective, you're not going to make a difference. The other element is you need to have the technology innovators. You need to have significant institutions that know how to bring new technologies to solve the problems that the clinical teams are able to identify. You need people that really are always pushing that envelope. And of course, the other thing that at that point, once you've got these ideas, you need the risk capital and, very importantly, the entrepreneurs who are in a position to drive things forward. I think one of the big tensions we see across the globe is so many innovators who are clinicians or technologists, frankly, are awful business people. And they really need to be able to work with business folks who basically, as a team, can drive things forward. And oftentimes, those business folks don't need to have the in-depth medical experience. They be coming from other industries. So I think a lot of the health tech ecosystems or med tech ecosystems that we see are drawing in from other ecosystems. So rather than trying to create this island, they're very much bordering into associated areas and being able to pull in risk capital. In the medtech area in particular, we're seeing as the kind of the smaller bets that have smaller rewards but higher probabilities of success. So those are some of the things I think we're seeing as very consistent themes for vibrant health tech ecosystems.
Prof. Sung and Prof. Tan, any perspectives from an Asian perspective? As we know that both of you are heavily involved in building ecosystems within Singapore and Korea. What's your thoughts?
Okay, it's a very sophisticated subject, even speaking Korean, but I'm supposed to speak in English. So I need to look at the conning my paper as I did in medical school back in 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Okay. Well, actually, to identify the ingredient for medtech innovation, it must be very important to how we define the ecosystem first. For instance, the Korean government values on the role of the hospital or the clinical medical doctors and the path through the gap between the research bench and the hospital patient bed. So as for that, Ministry of Health of the Korean government has launched two national projects. One is a research-driven hospital project. The second one is a medical innovation cluster project. So one common ingredient as a universal factor would be cultivation of human capital, especially for such a country as Korea, having few resources, but human resource. So that is my view. So the previous growth engine for Korean economy, such as the IT industry, has arrived at the plateau status, or even have been declining, while the new growth engine is not vivid yet. So that's why we need to maintain our R&D grant money to cultivate the potential human people. Yes, thank you.
So to add to Prof. Sung's point, I think traditionally the players in the value chain tend to be stovepiped. The innovators are in one ecosystem, the users, which are really the buyers of technologies in our ecosystem. And typically, if you look at how history evolved, it's really the technology looking for home. And it's really much more of an incremental game. I think it's come to the point because of the fact that the cost burden is becoming very heavy, that you can't afford to always pay for incremental advances anymore, and you have to start looking at value. You have to disrupt the whole way things are done. And coming back to what both John and also Prof. Song has alluded to, is the fact that for an ecosystem to thrive, there must be interdependency of various players in the value chain in a very integrated manner. How do you bring the outreach? It has to be really centered around the excellent medical care and good science. And then how do you bring the interface between the needs to be highlighted and the solution to be matched accordingly? The concept I always talk about is right tech, not best tech. Unfortunately, to the engineers here, sometimes it's a bit painful to hear that because they always want to have tech for tech's sake. Having said that, I do think that the whole environment in Asia is still evolving, but it gives us an opportunity to look at how can we contextualize the journey from our perspective. And in Singapore, I think the benefit that we have learning from both coasts of the US is really understand the end of the day is about human capital development. How do we nurture them, how to give them the right incentive, and how do we cultivate them and create interesting platforms for mentors to come in. And the fact that we do this also with the participation of the Korean government with us shows that this could be an international partnership as well. And really, I think it's about going as upstream as possible to even into the colleges, going into the med school, and I won't say brainwash them, but instill the right thought process. And this is something that I've been doing a lot. You know that the effort I spend with the Duke program, with the students who have an engineering first degree and go into medicine, and the success of that with also Rena, who came out from the program and went into a fellowship, gives testament to the fact that it can be done. And we have to think about not just create a platform for different people to work together, but someone who has multiple skill sets as well over time.
Sure. I mean, just to make sure that we're capturing what the panel have shared with us. What I'm hearing is the ingredients that have been shared is good hospitals, engineers, technical people who knows how to innovate, sufficient funding, the process of innovation being a needs-driven, not just a technology push, having different domain knowledge people come work together in a multidisciplinary environment rather than in silos. So I'm hearing these ingredients. So maybe for me to ask the panel back again, does it sound like these ingredients that you've mentioned are all universal factors? And just to kind of lighten this atmosphere up a little bit, right? A provocative question is, then why haven't we seen as much vibrancy in innovation in Asia as compared to US or the West? Is there any things that we need to do differently? Is it cultural? These ingredients seems to be universal. Why we haven't seen that? Yes.
Yes, my name is Fumi Keno from Stanford. So I'm living in Silicon Valley more than 10 years, 15 years, honestly. But I'm Japanese, so I travel to Japan almost more than 20 times per year. So I believe I understand both culture. So I think it's a mutual, similar experience in Asian countries. So our culture is risk-averse culture. So to take a risk is some kind of dangerous things. So that's a totally different between Silicon Valley. And also, each stakeholder doesn't understand what a starting up company is. For example, in Asia. For example, venture capital, they sometimes in Japan, they confuse, oh, that's grant. We can get money, or like a loan, financial loan or something. So we need to educate those people to understand the starting up company culture is. And especially in Japan, so from our experiences of industry, like Sony, Honda, Toyota, those companies were revolutionary technology oriented. And that's the success story. So for example, they believe, same as in medtech, so they believe they need revolutionary technology first and looking for needs. Yeah, that's some kind. That's our difficulty. And for the big companies, so we have a big company like a Terumo, Olympus, Toshiba, Hitachi. Those people believe not invented here syndrome. So they don't believe outside. So it means they cannot accept open innovation. That's some kind of, we have to change. So to change, we need a role model. We need a success story. That's my conclusion. But from Asia. In Asia, it's a chicken and egg, of course. Nobody knows which is first. But that's my.
So maybe let's have our local success story, not just in Singapore, in Asia. Yoshi, what do you have to say about that?
Well, having lived both here in Singapore and in the US for many years, I can see the difference between the two regions. The most distinctive one is the years of experience that US are able to provide in terms of what's been done. It's already there, like John mentioned. Ecosystem was there before anything started it. So over here, everything has to start from pretty much scratch. It will not be overnight. We relocated ourselves from California to Singapore about 6 years ago. And we also suffer some degree of a loss of talent. So in order to really see this being vibrant, number one, it must take time. And number two, like what Dr. Moreno said, you have to change a little bit of the cultural mindset. To fail is not altogether that bad, so long as in the end you succeed. So you just have to know what it really means. Sometimes you learn from the failures. So I would like to urge those local people to truly believe. In the past, market being always regarded as the U.S. and U.S.-centric. But today, look at the population composition. This part of the world consists of almost like a 55% of the total world. And it's really, really concentrated in this region. So if you believe in the need, the future of the market, and then you can really adopt whatever you have learned or we have learned from the US, and just turn around and then try to see what kind of things you can create a new ecosystem. I think universally, all the things mentioned above earlier by other members indeed have to be there. But I think the two things you cannot change is experience money cannot buy, and time, you just have to take it. So it's just a beginning, in my opinion.
If I can add, I think there is one opportunity in Asia that where the U.S. is handcuffed. And we said the point before about having good hospitals is really not, has not been the source of innovation. The source of innovation has been very innovative clinicians. And I think going forward on this value-based, it's around having hospital systems that are able to design and construct care paths that are very effective. And frankly, in the States, it's very, very hard for newcos, et cetera, to really understand what those care paths are. So I think Asia has an opportunity with the hospital systems to be able to take much more of a systemic view of where are the gaps, where are the value opportunities, and target improvements that certainly the clinicians can help with, but they're driven by systemic issues as opposed to the specific clinician-patient interface.
So that's a perfect segue to the next question, which is really talking about the role of public versus private support for the ecosystem. I think we've heard now that an ecosystem needs a lot of care and feeding, a lot of support. It also takes a village. There's a lot of components here to make it for a vibrant ecosystem, but if we can break it down into more simple terms, as we see in some examples in some countries, government plays a large role, and in terms of funding, as John mentioned, about hospital systems and access, but also industry and the private sector can also play a large role as well. So what we want to do is really ask the panels about some of the pros and cons of the roles of the public versus the private support. And I'd like to first turn it over to Zui to talk about the Singapore side. And my own experience with Singapore and how quickly we're able to establish SSB, we almost, I think, established it in about 6 months. In fact, we were negotiating the letter of intent, and essentially they said, we're going to have the signing ceremony in January, so figure out everything from June until January and get it all done, because we're going to have that signing ceremony, whether you like it or not. So.
Just to clarify that, I wasn't the one who said that then. But I think it's important, especially from the perspective of starting ecosystem, having some form of public support is actually very useful to create not just the infrastructure, but also the political stability that you need. Because in many instances, if you leave this entirely to market forces, sometimes there is market failure because the players are not sophisticated enough, and it will not start by itself. And whoever gets started will basically go through a tremendous amount of difficulty through the many valleys of death as well. And therefore, from Singapore's perspective, I think we do recognize that, for one, we are a small economy. We really have to constantly look at areas in which we can differentiate ourselves. We look at medtech back about 7-8 years ago as one of the potential growth sector where it could leverage off our very strong engineering capabilities on the ground, our deep clinical excellence, and also the base for potentially manufacturing of advanced products as well. And that's how we started doing this. And we really had to create the platform for not just the public sector players to get together. This would mean the universities, researchers, and also the hospital group, but also interface with the companies as well. Leaving this entirely to market forces, they won't talk, unfortunately. And we had to really step in and facilitate, and this is where some of the fortunate learnings from how Boston did it in an ecosystem-wide helped us. Layer upon this is the talent. And now, as we are moving into the next 5 years of a new phase of funding, is really to look at targeting the ecosystem towards focus areas such as disease burdens that are high in terms of affecting our quality of life, issues such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, infectious disease. So because Singapore is such a small country, but what happens in Asia is kind of representative for the larger Asia or Southeast Asia. And therefore, and also the fact that our racial mix here is representative of the Asian demographics as well. So there are things that we could do that can we really do something that is helpful for us to develop something that could leverage upon, not just the developed status in the upper segment of population in Asia, but also the middle class, the value segment as well. And this is where we're going to be a lot more targeted going forward in the next 5 years.
Great, thank you. And it's clear that in some governments, unlike the United States, it can move very nimbly and very quickly and effectively to make for very large macro change. I'd like to also get comments from Yo Chi, who arguably created the Guidance of Singapore, and love to kind of hear his thoughts from the private sector.
Well, I think, the first thing when I first came to Singapore that was to my surprise was how much grants were available everywhere. And then I think it's a good news. So I see a lot of people applying for it. But the bad news is that, there's really no so-called accountability. You get it, just like you have a rich parents who give you the money and without really expecting something from you other than saying, I help you. So I think, it has to have a certain balance, so to speak. As much as I think Singapore government is doing such an excellent job, I would still think there would need some kind of be a private sector let it be a good venture capitalist, VC coming in, or some individuals who has some experience to really make sure that if you get the money, there will be a consequence, and you just have to know it's not free. And sometimes, if you give free money too much, and it may be counterproductive. So it needs to be both. On one hand, we already see a lot of public support, but I just think you still need some private side to sort of control it and put a certain discipline to make sure that whoever received the money have to pay for it back.
Great, those are good comments. Professor Sun, you mentioned that the government plays a large, significant role in terms of development in Korea. Any comments you'd like to add and lessons you learned there?
The Korean government has invested 2.5 billion US dollar a year for the biohealth R&D. But the major in Korea, the investment from the public sector focuses on the area having high impacts on the medical expenses or insurance or finances, as well as the area sensitive to public, such as MERS infection just before. So even the standpoint of the industrialization, we still believe there must be a role of a public sector to reach a certain point of mass of economical scale. So, however, considering the public sector investment necessarily requires the involvement of the government officers and the bureaucratic things. So that after crossing a certain point, the weight must move to the private sector. We like a Korean Medical Innovation Cluster. That is the typical example of a third sector project. That is when the project consists of public and the private sector together. So in that case, it is very important to maintain the balance between the public service versus self-reliant financing. So it's truly challenging for me to run the Medical Innovation Foundation and Cluster to make the balance.
Yes, I think this is a familiar theme. I think that Yoichi and Professor Sun really summarized it well. What is the point in time where you kind of take off the training wheels and allow a company or a group of innovators to really kind of roll on their own? I'd like to also ask Fumi, as our newest biodesign partner in Japan. I think we've seen through this process in building this nascent program that the government played a very large role in bringing together now 3 different universities to really collaborate. And I think the history, if you don't know this, is that these universities normally don't play well together. It's kind of a rivalry, like Cal and Stanford. But the government played a role in trying to bring these 3 groups together. And I know it's early days, but love to get your perspective on where you see the handoff between the government and the public sector, and where does the role of the private sector play here?
Sure. So since 2001, I'm in Silicon Valley, so I'm a medical device person, and I shouted in Japan, so medical device is very important business territory, but nobody listened to me. Medical device, small market, why don't you do pharmaceutical? That's a typical. But 2013, so our new Prime Minister Abe, he says 3 strategies to reverse of Japanese economy. So the third one is healthcare. He said most important thing is medical device. And suddenly people change. Oh, Fumi, I need you. And the Japanese government call me, honestly, call to my cell phone. Okay, please come to Japan. We have to discuss for some strategy. And so the Japanese government decided. So why? Because I think, as I told you, so Japanese culture is a typical risk-averse culture. So, but if private people say, oh, if government say yes, oh, it's probably safe. And many support, financial support, sometimes political support by government. So, and suddenly change. For example, Japan Biodesign Program. So I talked with the chairman of JFMDA, that's the Japanese Federation of Medical Device Association. He is Mr. Nakao. He is also chairman of Telmo Corporation. I discussed. Oh, but we need, by the way, we need something, so educational system to create the ecosystem. That's the biodesign. Oh, he was very interested in, but nobody listened to us, honestly. And even the 3 universities, their faculties, their boss didn't listen to us. Why biodesign? What's that? You know, is that work? And you know, there's some risk. You know, our culture is totally different. But this April, past April, our prime minister visited Stanford University. He officially said, okay, Stanford Biodesign Program is one of the most important education system between Japan and Silicon Valley. So the people suddenly change. Oh, okay, biodesign is the best program. And, you know, that's a typical. So that's our culture. But be careful. So usually government support only 3 years. And sometimes 5 years. So at that time, 3 or 5 years later, we should prepare. So maybe we're going to lose all of the funding, maybe all of the support. So now we are thinking to involve industry through the JFMDA more, especially financially and also human resources. So gradually, you know, we transfer from public domain to private domain. And hopefully 5 years later, we can have some 100% private system. That's I hope, but that's a typical Japanese culture.
I hope your program gets funding more than 3 years. And I do hope our program don't get the funding get cut in 3 years. But I think we've reached a very insightful part of this discussion, that between this private and public sector support, maybe perhaps for some of our panelists are alluding to the hints that in Asia, because of the cultural bend, that we are maybe a little bit more risk adverse, and we are a little bit more obedient to higher authority, that the government coming in to set up a more systematic approach to start something, to fund something, may be something that is more uniquely in Asia for it to kickstart. So, so I think that's a pretty interesting insight. I think this also, it's a good segue into the next question. Okay, I shall attempt to multitask. Okay. Okay, so we've heard that, yes, there are universal factors to how Asia can be successful in innovation, but we are recognizing there's cultural differences. We are recognizing that, Joshua was mentioning, we don't have the experience. We will need time for people to build the experience. And one of the comments that came out earlier to reverse that is role models, mentors. How can we have this shining armor hero that we can all look up to kind of characterize that process? So question is, to the panel, do we think that we have a lack of good role models in Asia? How do we change that? And I want to direct that back to Mr. Liu Yoshi, who is arguably our role model here. Then then also for Paul and John to comment, because a very big part of Stanford Biodesign in Silicon Valley and the CIMMIT, the Boston ecosystem, is mentoring, is paying it forward so that we have a virtuous culture. So I'd like to direct these questions to the 3 panelists.
Thank you, Ray. Yeah, I feel like, I'm the one who's talking a lot, but I hope it makes a lot of sense to all of you in the audience. You know, the mentorship is just almost like something that you have to have. You know, if you don't, then you really have to kind of blindly search for things, and then there will be lots of mistakes you make. And then for the first time, you will learn through mistakes. So if those people in Asia were too afraid to fail, then you should hang on to someone who has succeeded before. We are very fortunate, biosensors. We started not really in Singapore. We really started out in California, where we were lucky to have Stanford, nearby. And then we did a lot of a core lab with Peter Fitz and Dr. Morino's place. And we've got the Professor Ibarha Grube that really worked with us closely in first human implants. And then on top of it, we were in LA, and then we were very convenient to go to Cedars-Sinai, where it's also very active in the animal labs and understanding, what all the technologies were all about. So those were things that it really helped us in a great deal. So I can name a few doctors like Dr. Frank Litvak, who really helped myself and my team to really learn what is this interventional cardiology was all about. So it's really a must that you have to have a mentorship. And now biosensors has become one of the more prominent medical device companies here in Singapore. And then I also have Pepe Calle, who is our incoming CEO. He's done a very good job in the last 12 months. And then I would like to call upon companies like Biosensors to really initiate some kind of a mentorship to really bring some of the SSB graduates to have a chance to learn about things in the medical technology space. But when it comes to business, that's something it's really hard to teach. You need to find a partner, and I'm available for a partner, okay? No, all joking aside, I really think that's something I'm very happy to also render my services as a form of paying back to the society. And now, we have reached a level where Pepe can take over, and then I'm taking a more of a back seat role, and it will be my pleasure just to be part of this mentorship, if there should be such a role that I can play. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen in Boston is clearly the role of mentorship is critically important. We're fortunate to be able to tap into the ecosystem of entrepreneurs, and many of them work for CIMMYT for no cost. Some we have to pay for, but it's worth every penny. But without question, we ask, why do you do this? And the answer comes back, not so much giving back, it's they have to do it. They love it. They learn. So I think the whole idea in mentorship in the Boston area is it's really not around necessarily altruism about giving back. It's about learning, it's about connecting, it's about making networks actually work. It's a fairly interesting dynamic because the other thing you often hear about due diligence, et cetera. How is due diligence typically done in the med tech sector? I call Fred, he calls Sally, and that just happens naturally. And a lot of that is basically, working as part of a system with an expectation that when I give something, I get 10 times back. Maybe not directly, but sooner or later. And that's an expectation that people have. If you want to play this game, that you contribute. And sooner or later, good things will happen without necessarily a direct quid pro quo.